World War I, also called the Great War, was the beginning of the end for European hegemony in the world. The war was the cause of many world-changing events that happened during the nightmarish 20th century, like the rise of communism, fascism, the Cold War, and the conflicts still going on in the Middle East to this day. The Great War is often overlooked because it was overshadowed by the atrocities of the Second World War, which started just 21 years later. But without the first one, the Second World War might not have happened at all. That's why it's so important to understand how it all started, and why the European powers decided to wage this brutal war against themselves and throw the continent into misery for decades to come. The thing with World War I is that it's really not easy to understand how it all started, because so many countries and individuals were involved in its outbreak. But in this video, I'll try my best to give you an overview and also clear up some of the misconceptions that have been repeated over and over by history teachers to this day. Since the late 19th century, the once big and mighty Ottoman Empire was in a phase of steady decline. The fairly new country of Italy, on the other hand, was trying to become a major player on the European continent and was looking to snatch some provinces from the Ottomans. In 1911, Italy decided to attack Libya and expand the size of its empire. After a year of bloodshed, the Ottomans lost their North African province, and Libya officially became part of Italy. What makes the Italian invasion of Libya so significant in understanding the beginning of World War I is that the conflict made it abundantly clear to everyone that the Ottoman Empire was just a shell of its former glory, and that its military had become unable to defend itself. This realization inspired the Balkan states to declare war on the Ottomans, an attempt to kick them out of Europe once and for all. What followed was two bloody Balkan wars, in which Serbia's territory almost doubled in size. This was obviously a massive win for Serbia, and sparked the creation of several Serbian terror organizations, like the Black Hand, whose aim was to create a greater Serbian empire that would include all of Bosnia. There was a problem, though. Bosnia, along with some of the other territories Serbia wanted to annex, was part of Austria-Hungary, Serbia's neighbor to the north and longtime rival. The Black Hand knew that a conflict with Austria was inevitable to help them achieve their goals, so they devised a plan to assassinate the Austrian Archduke, who was next in line to the throne. On the 28th of June, the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, visited the capital of Bosnia in Sarajevo to inspect the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Armed Forces. The day of his visit was not an ordinary day, though. It was also Serbia's national holiday, and for them, this was like a spit in their faces. The governor of Bosnia, Oskar Potiorek, realized the danger that this visit would bring to the safety of the Archduke and warned him in advance. Franz, on the other hand, didn't take this warning seriously at all and demanded there to be less police presence than what the officials originally planned. Looking back, this was a terrible mistake. To prove how ridiculous the idea someone was out to assassinate him was, he decided to go on a motorcade, in a car without a rooftop, through the city of Sarajevo, on a route that was published in advance in a well-known Bosnian newspaper. While Franz and his wife Sophie were driving along the scenic roads of Sarajevo, a person in the crowd threw a bomb that bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded underneath the next one, injuring 2 Austrian generals and a couple of bystanders. At this point, the motorcade should have probably been canceled, considering that Potiorek's warning of an assassination attempt turned out to be true. Franz, on the other hand, decided to drive to the hospital to pay his generals a visit. In order to not fall into the hands of other possible conspirators, they decided to change the route. Problem was, they forgot to let the driver in on the new plan. So once they came to a crossing where the driver should have stayed on the road, he instead made a right turn. Franz shouted at him angrily to immediately turn around and get onto the new route. Little did they know that right next to them stood Gavrilo Princip, one of the assassinators, who couldn't believe his luck. So while the driver tried to turn the big car on the small Bosnian street, Gavrilo walked up to them, drew his gun, and shot 2 bullets. The first one killed Franz. The second one his wife Sophie. The Austrians were furious and immediately blamed Serbia for the assassination. The chief of staff of the Austro-Hungarian military, Konrad Hötzendorf, wanted to immediately declare war on the Serbs, but the foreign minister, Leopold Berchtold, instead wanted to wait and gather evidence. And then there was the Prime Minister of Hungary, who was entirely against a war, partly because he didn't think the Germans would back them up. He also thought a war would cause severe internal conflicts within the empire. The Austro-Hungarian government couldn't decide on what to do next, but they all agreed that they needed support from Germany, since they knew that a war against Serbia would bring in Russia, and there was no way on earth Austria alone could beat their neighbor to the east. On July 5th, Alexander Hoyos, an Austro-Hungarian diplomat, traveled to Berlin to inquire if the Germans were willing to back them up in a possible conflict against Serbia. That is when the German Kaiser, and also the Chancellor, gave the Austrians the famous blank check, meaning they would support Austria no matter what. The Germans did insist on a swift attack against Serbia, so that the other nations of Europe had no time to react, and were still shocked about the assassination. What the Germans didn't know was that the Prime Minister of Hungary was not particularly fond of an attack on Serbia, which meant that there was still a lot of convincing to do within the Austro-Hungarian government, rendering a fast attack impossible. The Germans thought a Russian invasion to be unlikely, since Russia wasn't prepared, and probably wouldn't back a country willing to execute a prince, since Russia itself was a monarchy. And even if the Russians would get involved, it would still be better for Germany to have a war now than in a couple of years, because the Russian militarization was speeding up, and experts predicted that a war against Russia in 2 or 3 years would be nearly impossible for Germany to win. On July 5th, one of the assassins confessed that they were trained by an official Serbian army major, thickening the evidence that the Serbian government was involved in the assassination. 2 days later, the Austro-Hungarian Council of Ministers met in Vienna to formulate a response to the assassination of their Archduke. All the members agreed on a surprise attack on Serbia, except for, again, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who insisted on first sending the Serbs an ultimatum, and only after that should Austria-Hungary consider war. This disagreement in the government severely slowed down the idea of a swift attack in order to prevent a European escalation. The Austrian foreign minister initially planned to send the ultimatum on the 15th of July, but the Hungarian prime minister reminded him that he and the whole council, which could be summoned at the earliest on the 19th of July, had to approve the text first. This means another 4 days passed without an official Austrian response. And when the 19th came, the Austrians still didn't send their ultimatum, because they realized that the French president, Raymond Poincaré, planned a visit to the Russian capital, and since the Austrians didn't want the Russians to directly discuss their response to their ultimatum with their strongest ally, France, they delayed it another 3 days. The reason why all of these delays are important is because at this point the assassination was no longer in the news in the minds of the people in Europe, making an Austrian attack on Serbia all the more shocking.
Funnily enough, Austria actually sent a telegram to their embassy in the Russian capital of St. Petersburg to ask when the French president was going to leave Russia. The Russians intercepted this message and knew that the Austrians were up to something. So when the French president arrived in Russia, the two countries got straight to discussing a response to an Austrian attack on Serbia. The French basically gave the Russians a similar blank check, like the Germans gave the Austrians. Another important fact is that prior to the outbreak of World War I, French banks were heavily financing the construction of Russian railway lines towards the German border. The French knew that the faster the Russians were able to mobilize their troops against Germany, the safer France would be in a possible war. All of this made the Russians confident to step in and convince Serbian officials to refuse Austrian demands made in the ultimatum. On the 23rd of July, Austria finally delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, without showing the Germans its contents, despite explicitly promising them to do so. There is a lot of debate still going on about why Austria decided to not show their ultimatum to their ally, but one reason might be that they knew that the demands would be unacceptable. In the ultimatum, Austria demanded Serbia to suppress anti-Austrian propaganda, dissolve terror organizations like the Black Hand, and to let Austrian officials participate in the investigation of the assassination on Serbian soil. On the 24th of July, Serbia sent a telegram to Russia, stating that they would accept any demand that the Russians advised them to accept. So basically, the Serbians were asking the Russians for advice and support in the matter. The Russian foreign minister advised them to accept the harmless ones, but deny points 5 and 6, which demanded Austrian officials to work on the investigation of the murder on Serbian soil. The Russian foreign minister also explicitly ensured Serbia that they could count on Russian support. On the 24th of July, one day before the Serbs would send their answer to the ultimatum, Russia already decided on a partial mobilization, which meant getting 1.1 million soldiers ready for war. This was a massive escalation of the whole conflict. At this point, no other country was ready for war. A day later, the Serbs delivered their answer to the ultimatum, and it would take another 2 days until Austria declared war on Serbia, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. By this time, Germany got news of massive amounts of troops being assembled at the German and Austrian borders and informed Britain. The British foreign minister told the German ambassador that there was no evidence of Russian troops at the German border. At this point, the Chancellor and the Kaiser of Germany must have realized that their plan didn't go as planned and should have probably called the Austrians back. But to do so would have meant that Germany would have lost their only remaining ally, so they didn't do it. On the 30th of July, Russia announced their general mobilization. A day later, Germany sent an ultimatum to Russia, demanding that it stop all its mobilization within 12 hours. The 12 hours passed without an answer from the Russians, and so Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. Now Germany was facing a war on 2 fronts, but they had a plan. They would first attack France through Belgium and Luxembourg in order to bypass the heavily fortified French border and strike their army from behind. After a swift win against France, all German troops would be transported to the east to focus on Russia. On August 2nd, Germany invaded Luxembourg, and a day later they did the same in Belgium, where German troops committed war crimes against Belgian civilians. Because of this violation of Belgian neutrality, Great Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, and the war began to unfold.
If you enjoyed this video and don't want to miss out on new episodes about all types of historical topics, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. Next episodes will come very soon. Have a nice day.